I'm Shilo Brooks. I'm a professor and CEO, and I believe reading good books makes us better men. Today, I'm sitting down with Rob Henderson. Rob is the best-selling author of Troubled, a memoir of foster care, family, and social class. Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell, published in 1933, changed Rob's life. Today, I'm asking him why. This is Old School. Rob Henderson, welcome to Old School.
Thanks, Shilo. Great to be here.
Man, it is great to have you. You've given me a really, really remarkable book, an early Orwell book that I'd never read before. You know, in high school, everybody and their mother has read 1984 and Animal Farm.
Yeah.
But I feel like nobody has read Down and Out in Paris and London.
Right. Well, as you mentioned, so Down and Out in Paris and London, it was actually Orwell's first book published under that name. So he was born Eric Blair, and he used this name, George Orwell, for this book, which was published in 1933. And there was no special meaning to this name, George Orwell. He chose it at random because he wanted to spare his parents the embarrassment of having a son who was living as a down and out in Paris and in London. He'd grown up in, he described his family as lower upper middle class.
Yeah.
And his father, I believe, was an executive for the opium trade in British India. And he spends his early 20s as a police officer in Burma, which he describes in a separate book. But after Burma, he goes to London and Paris and kind of tries to make a go of it as a writer. And he wanted to, what he described, sort of shedding these class prejudices that he believed he held, and wanted to live among people who were living on the margins of society. And it was, for me, kind of a revelation. First time I read this book, I was 15 the first time I read this. And I think I had just read Animal Farm for class. And, you know, it's funny, and you can probably attest to this as an educator, but when you're assigned a reading as a student, you don't enjoy it as much as when you choose something on your own. And so I read Animal Farm, like, this was entertaining, it was interesting. But then as I was passing through the school library, I saw Down and Out in Paris and London. I saw the name Orwell, and I thought, oh, what's this? And I thought it was going to be another kind of fiction book, maybe another book about talking animals. I'm like, what's this? I flipped through it, and this is a nonfiction book about his own personal experiences and his brushes with poverty. And I picked it up, and at that time, I was in pretty rough shape in terms of my financial situation at home, kind of family situation in general. And yeah, I read the book, I think, in maybe 3 or 4 days that first time.
Yeah, so it's a book that really resonated with you. I mean, we'll talk later about you being, in a way, a kind of Orwellian figure. I mean, you wrote a book about being down and out in a certain sense. But let's start with this book. So can you just tell folks, what is this book about?
The first half of the book, Orwell describes his experiences as a young man. He's kind of 23, 24 years old, living in kind of hostels, wards, homeless shelters, and he gets a job in Paris as the French word, I'm probably mispronouncing it, plongeur.
Yeah, it's good enough for me.
And the word translates essentially to kind of busboy, dishwasher. And some of those passages from the book are the most memorable, where he's describing the kind of misery of scrubbing dishes in a hotel basement. People are coming and going. The cooks are screaming at each other. The servers are yelling. All kinds, different languages, all corners of Europe. You hear, German cooks yelling at French, waiters, yelling at Orwell, who doesn't speak either. And he's just attempting to describe the order that arises out of this chaos. The kitchen of this hotel restaurant. Everyone's shouting, there's bells being rung, food that needs to be prepped. There's a nice line in there where Orwell describes his restaurant work as it's like sorting a deck of cards against the clock. And I was a dishwasher when I'd read that, and so I'm reading this and I thought, yeah, that makes sense. And essentially Orwell's saying that this kind of work, this menial work in a restaurant, it's simple enough. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of brain power to do, but it's a challenge in the sense that you are pressed for time always. Like the next dish needs to be cooked, that table needs to be cleared, these plates need to be scrubbed, and every time you turn around, there's another task that needs to be accomplished, and you're constantly pushing against it to prevent the patrons from waiting too long. And so his description of that kind of chaos was fascinating to me. And then his descriptions of living among the people who were down and out in Paris, people who were down on their luck. Some of them were born impoverished, others found themselves penniless over time. And yeah, Orwell is just describing this from the vantage point of someone who himself was born into privilege and was attempting to get into the minds of these people, the interior thoughts and reflections and everyday experiences. And Orwell describes what it's like when you're living day to day, week to week. He talks about how your whole world shrinks to your job and to the next day you have off, the next meal you might have.
This is not a novel in the traditional sense of the term. In other words, you began by saying Orwell himself went. Well, how do I put this? He went to Eton. He went to all the finest schools.
Right.
And he comes in and wants to be a writer and has these writerly ambitions and has written some things. They haven't gone off that well. And so in a way, he goes on a journalistic adventure. And we should talk about that and how that might color the book. But when you say he met these characters, when you say there's this dishwasher, when you say these sorts of things, these are things that really happened to Orwell.
Yeah.
And so this book is in a certain way a piece of journalism mixed with memoir and that sort of thing. And he meets these three characters that really stood out in my mind. The first is that while he's in Paris as a dishwasher, he meets a man named Boris, who's a Russian, who has a kind of lame foot, who is sort of eternally optimistic, always seems to kind of sabotage himself, though, and sabotage their hopes of getting jobs and these sorts of things. And then he meets in London, this man, Paddy. And Paddy seems sort of resigned, maybe resentful, uneducated. And then there's a third character he meets toward the end, which is a man named Bozo. And I think that's how you pronounce it. Could be Bozo. I don't know. I hope it's not Bozo because I really admire this character who's an intellectual kind of artist and thoughtful poor man. And it occurred to me that what Orwell seemed to be doing, since he himself was not poor, was exploring the pathologies of poverty by way of sort of trying to live the life, but also by isolating different aspects of it and different aspects of the psychology of poverty through the exploration of these characters, these three in particular.
Yeah, well, I think it's to Orwell's great credit that he did not attempt to impose any ideological doctrine in advance, where he tells, so all three of these men have roughly similar sort of physical, material conditions. I mean, Boris had an injury, but in terms of their poverty, they were very similar, and yet they responded to it very differently. And I think Orwell was trying to say here that there's a subjectivity to it, that each person experiences poverty in a different way, that you can't make these blanket statements about the poor and how they're going to react or how they're going to behave, that if you put 10 people in a very impoverished environment, you'll have 10 different unique stories and how they'll react to it. And Orwell himself, I think, struggled with this as well, because it was a kind of a version of slum tourism, this book, because he himself was not, he was a person who came from relatively, prosperous means, his parents and his family, and he was putting himself through these conditions. And I think he was wrestling with, through each of those stories, what is poverty? How bad is it? How are we to think about it?
Old School is proudly brought to you by the Jack Miller Center. In a time when our democracy faces real challenges, one question matters more than ever. Are we preparing the next generation to understand and uphold the principles that define America? At the Jack Miller Center, they believe the answer begins in the classroom. Their mission is bold: to revive the teaching of America's founding ideas, documents, and history on college campuses, in K-12 schools, and beyond. Since 2004, the center has built a national network of over 1,300 scholars who are bringing the American political tradition to life for students across the country. And through their Teach for Freedom campaign, they're working to reach millions more by 2026, our nation's 250th anniversary. Because a strong democracy depends on informed citizens. If you believe in the importance of civic education and want to help prepare the next generation to carry on our democracy, join us at jackmillercenter.org. That's jackmillercenter.org. Yeah, I wonder what you make of. I thought Boris was particularly interesting.
Mhm.
He's the first character in the book who Orwell kind of teams up with. He promises him, he's like, "Look, man, I know we got nothing, but I know I can get us a job. I can get
Mhm.
us a job in Paris. I'm a waiter. I'm not just a waiter. I've been the head waiter.
Mhm.
I got this." And so he's always telling Orwell, "Tomorrow's the day, man. Tomorrow's the
Yeah,
day."
yeah.
And like Orwell finds him living in an apartment with another guy who like pays him a little bit of money every day. This guy Boris, and this guy lives off of like nothing. And Orwell comes to visit him every day, and they go and get some small amount of food. And he promises him, "Hey, you're gonna tomorrow's the day we get a job," and they never do. And then they get offered a job, and then the guy's like, "Well, let's not take it because there's this other restaurant across the way that's going to be better. We should go work there." And so it occurred to me, I know people. I grew up in a small town. A lot of folks didn't go to college. I know people who, like Boris, have the best intentions in the world for themselves, but they cannot seize an opportunity, and they're constantly victims of self-sabotage. And I find this to be pretty common among friends of mine who, didn't grow up in affluent circumstances. I did not myself, but they can't see that opportunity. And I wondered if you had a reflection on that, if you've met people like that in your life where they're this close to getting out. There's an opportunity that comes their way, and then they sabotage themselves. And it happens over and over and over.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't fully connected those dots until you started to describe it. So because Boris is so optimistic and upbeat,
Yeah.
and I do know people like that who I grew up with who kept getting in their own way, these self-defeating behaviors, but they were optimistic in I guess a less cheerful way, where just almost like this arrogance or bravado, like it's always going to work out for me, things are going to go well. Whereas Boris was almost kind of humorous and I don't know, less confrontational about his feelings about the future. But yes, I think there is something there. There's a fear, I think, of success, of something if you grow comfortable with the conditions of squalor or poverty or disorder, and then finally there's an avenue out, and there's this fear that maybe you'll have to adjust to a new way of life, that maybe you won't measure up, or that if you succeed and then come back down, there will be a kind of a humiliation or a disgrace. Whereas if you continue at the place that you're at, you never have to worry or set your sights any higher. And I was shocked repeatedly throughout my life. So, trying to extend a hand to some of the guys I grew up with, and sometimes they would say yes, but then they keep putting it off. And in other occasions, they would just flat out say no. They have their own thing going on, like they don't need help. There's a kind of a pride there too. And it took me a long time to accept that most people, even people who are doing well in their lives, they do not like unsolicited advice.
Yeah.
They just, if they come to you and ask, even then it can be risky how you frame the advice. You never want to seem like you're better than someone else. But people who, it was just shocked. I was 19, 20, 21 years old and just kind of starting to get my foot on the ladder and telling my friends, hey, like this is working out for me, or why don't we try that? And I I had one friend who kind of took my advice out of maybe I probably tried to give unsolicited advice to maybe 10 or 15 guys. One of them sort of took the advice. So gives you a sense of, just how little it can help unless the person is mentally prepared for it. But I guess this is one of the points Orwell makes too, is that when you've lived that life for so long, it can be hard to capitalize on opportunities when they present themselves.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's true. And like, I know guys who they'll get a job and it'll be their whole sustenance and they don't hesitate to walk away and quit. Like if they get mad at somebody on the construction site that day, they're out of there. You know what I mean? And for me, I don't have that in me. Like I will do anything you say because I need this money. But it amazes me, in other words, the way people who I know who are, as Orwell might say, down and out, have the kind of courage to stick to that. But like, you could take this job and shove it.
Mhm.
So let's talk about Orwell's presentation of poverty. You've alluded to that several times in your remarks. But one aspect of this that I think can't help but bubble to the surface in any discussion of it is, Orwell himself wasn't, as you've said, a man of no means or of low means. And so there's some question, I suspect, especially it would be raised in a classroom in our time, about the veracity of the presentation. You see this all the time. Could a white man write a novel about a black woman having not been a black one? Well, can a rich person write a an examination of poor people without having been a poor person. So there's some question here about the veracity of this account. And I wonder if you have thoughts on both that subject, which is such a hot subject today, but also about Orwell himself and his attempt to, in a certain sense, go and embody, people might even derisively say role play, a poor person. Is that kind of authentic and legitimate? Is that just what journalism is simply? And so, or is that something we should take kind of, offense at or something like that?
Yeah, well, it's probably useful to know that that's what this book is.
Yeah.
That, know something of Orwell's background before reading the book. Whereas for me, I felt this, probably unfair sense of betrayal so I read the book, as I mentioned, in high school. I knew nothing of, I knew Road Animal Farm, but I knew nothing about his background or how he had grown up, that he was an Eton man. And then I pick up this book and, I found it fascinating, his account, and then later discovered, how he'd grown up. But then later, kind of through my own experiences with social mobility, of recognizing that in some ways it probably helped that he was speaking from the vantage point of someone of relative means, because it got other people to listen and pay attention to him. Whereas, if Boris had written this book, or a similar account, probably fewer people would have taken it seriously, for better or worse.
One of the reasons I tell my students to read books and to read widely, and especially to read biography and autobiography, is that one of the things that reading a book allows you to do is live the life of a person who's not you. And you have a boring life. Your life is one. It's, you're going to live your 180-year chunk and then it's over. But there's a way to become fuller, a way to become wider, a way to become more vital, and that is to take the lives of others into yourself. Mm-hmm. That's what the imagination does. And so to say that Orwell doesn't have access to poor people because he wasn't one is to deny the power of the imagination to give to you some transformative insight into the life of another and allow you to contain some piece of them within you. So if I read a biography of George Washington or Frederick Douglass or Sandra Day O'Connor, I teach some of these people, I contain pieces of them in me, even though I'm not a slave from the 19th century. I'm not a guy from the 1700s, and I'm not a woman who's coming up in the late 20th century. Mm-hmm. So I just think that criticism denies at its essence the power of what literature is, which is to take something that is alien to you and allow it to be metabolized into you through reading.
What Orwell did, I thought, was, and a lot of other authors who've adopted this journalistic approach, is it can also help those very people they're writing about understand their own circumstances in a different way. So one passage I really like from Down and Out in Paris and London is when Orwell arrives at a Spike, a government-run homeless shelter, and he's nervous because he's not technically homeless. He's got his parents. And so he's taking a bit of a risk, and he was risking arrest potentially for taking a bed in one of these shelters, which maybe there's some ethical kind of a dubious quality there, but he tries to enter this shelter and learn what it's like to stay in a place like this. And the person who oversees the shelter asks him his occupation or what was his occupation. And Orwell says, a journalist, I guess. And the guy says, oh, so you're a gentleman. And Orwell says, oh, I suppose so. And then the guy says, very...
right.
He's like, oh, that's bloody bad luck, governor. Like, that's really bad. Like, suddenly he expresses this immense sympathy for Orwell. Like, oh, a journalist, a gentleman in a homeless shelter? That's awful. And so usually when they were processing the intakes, the new arrivals, they would search their belongings and their bags and make sure they drugs, weapons, contraband, whatever. And they skipped the invasive search for Orwell, let him in. Later, they give him a clean towel. They don't do this for the other wards. And Orwell is kind of reflecting on this ingrained class prejudice that, they treated him differently, even though materially he was apparently no different than anyone else. He was down on his luck, but his background, his accent, his occupation, suddenly he's being treated in this very different way, and that this respectability is a kind of a resource on its own. And I think a lot of people, poor people included, wouldn't necessarily connect those dots until they saw someone writing from that perspective.
Yeah. So his difference gives him access to something in the inquiry that he wouldn't have had access to had he not been
Mhm.
different from those folks.
Exactly.
Which is another benefit.
Mhm.
The book is really split in two. I mean, we've talked about the characters, Boris and Patty, and you've got this guy Bozo. But I was curious to get your thoughts on why Orwell thinks it's important to present Paris and London.
Hmm.
In other words, it's not down and out in Paris, and it's not down and out in London. It's down and out in Paris and London. And the kind of poverty that he experiences in each place is different. So in Paris, he's working like a dog. I mean, he is working for, 14 hours a day. I mean, he goes through his whole schedule, and it's just like, you're just like, geez, my God. At this restaurant, as this kind of dishwasher, as you've pointed out, just has time to like sleep and get back to work, sort of a thing. He does that for a while. It wears him out. He hears from a friend in London that there's some kind of disabled child there that needs a caretaker, and if you can get to London, you can get a good wage by being a caretaker for this child. And so he resigns his job in Paris. I mean, resigns, that's a very formal term for a dishwasher, but leaves his job in Paris and comes to London. He gets there, and there's a holdup. The parents have decided they want to wait, or they're out of town. I don't really remember what happened, but there's a hold. And so he's got to kind of hang around London and just kind of be idle and bored and get by on very little money and nothing in the street.
Mhm.
And so you get this half of the book that's work, 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 no time for thought. You're not bored because you're working so hard. And then there's half of the book that's like, what am I doing? I'm just here. I'm bored. I don't have a job. Those are two very different aspects of poverty and two very different kinds of poverty.
Yeah, in Paris, Orwell is kind of what people might today call like the working poor, living on the margins of society, very sort of working class poverty, struggling to make ends meet. And he talks about foregoing laundry and all of the accompanying and petty humiliations along the way. Of, now that you don't do laundry, you smell differently, and you smell differently, so people treat you differently, and people treat you differently, and it affects how you see yourself, and so on. And then in London, it's much more of a like sort of unsheltered poverty. He's homeless, he's struggling, he's sleeping on a bench along the embankment, and he's staying in these homeless shelters. There may be some cultural component there as well, that there are sort of layers of poverty, depending on how you look at it and what your experience is, but then also which country you're in, what city you're in, what incentives are in place for you.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that cultural point, because when he says toward the end of the book that one of the problems is that people seem to think that these folks who are out in the streets, the tramps, as they're called, that's his term, that they don't want to work. He says, no, they do want to work. And that got me to thinking, because you mentioned, well, is there a cultural thing? I wondered about America. What is the character of American poverty? Is the character of it that people don't want to work and that's the cause of it? Or is it they do want to work and they can't get a job? Because he claims these folks are working people, especially someone like Patty. He would have been a great laborer.
Mhm.
He can't hold down a job. And so the cause of his poverty is not idleness. It's not vice.
Mhm.
He's a virtuous man in the sense that he wants to work.
This book was published nearly a century ago, 92 years ago, and my suspicion is that you probably didn't have to make that many mistakes to be down and out in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, especially if you were already sort of barely making ends meet. And so the people who were poor, they did want to work. They were different. It was a different time. Developed Western countries were less prosperous, fewer social services available, far fewer powerful recreational drugs. I mean, Orwell talks a lot about the pleasures of a cigarette, tobacco. When you're poor, you got to take what you can get. These sort of small joys. But and alcohol, alcohol plays a role in the book as well. But there's no fentanyl, there's no opioids, there's no heroin, and I do wonder if today, the character of homelessness is different because of those reasons. That do they want to work? Some of them maybe do, but if your motivational systems are hijacked by substances and mental illness and all these other things that were seemingly less pervasive, at least the kind of poverty that Orwell was writing about, that people are responding differently, and maybe back then work was also emphasized as a sort of a cultural norm. It was valorized. If you didn't work, you were a bum, you were a tramp, you were all these pejorative names for a young, able-bodied male who wasn't working. Whereas today, a lot of those, it's less stigmatized.
There's a character in the book named Bazo who is educated in the sense that he's reflective. In other words, he's the only character who Orwell meets, so far as I recall, who, when he meets him, he has admiration for him. And he seems to say, this guy's special. And I can't remember the exact line, but he deeply enjoys these conversations with him. And one of the things that Bazo has, so his job, as jobs go, is that he seems to be a kind of artist. He draws in chalks, like apparently just beautiful pictures on the sidewalk. People come by and sort of pay him or something like that for these. But he also has a peculiar capacity to make sense of his circumstances. In other words, he's impoverished, he's down and out on his luck, but that doesn't bother him. In other words, he's not resentful about it. Not only is he not resentful about it, he seems to think in a way, I mean, he's almost got like a Zen sense-making apparatus. It's the way of the world, and we shouldn't be upset about these things. And there's a kind of depth and peace and comfort in his poverty because it permits him to devote himself to certain, I don't know, I don't want to say philosophic, sort of reflective and artistic pursuits. And so there's this difference between educated poverty and uneducated poverty, in that Orwell, who is himself educated, and Bazo, who is at least reflective, seem to be able to reflect deeply on this poverty, make sense of it, and it doesn't touch their hearts in a kind of corruptive and demeaning way. The other characters, Boris and others, I mean, it's really degraded them. They do very degraded things. And so I wondered about the kind of difference between being impoverished as a person who's educated. There's a great example of this in the Western tradition, a man by the name of Socrates, who has no money and is yet somehow rich in his reflection, versus being impoverished and being uneducated, and how that shapes one's understanding of one's circumstances.
I also wonder if there's this maybe an increased sympathy for the less educated poor, because it almost seems like Bazo, and especially in the case of Orwell, that their decision to live this way is more of a choice. That if you are educated, you can find a way. I mean, maybe you're not going to, if Bazo's making these drawings and these paintings and these artistic works, but he could probably find a way to acquire work in some other way to sustain himself. But he chooses to do this. There seems to be an element of agency involved there. Whereas for someone like Boris, far fewer options. It seems like less of a choice. There's more sympathy that he elicits, and we feel worse for him. I think, yes, it's like the example of Socrates too. And you're able to make peace with it maybe in a different way too, because you're so reflective, this sort of metacognitive, I'm stepping back and observing my circumstances and maybe using them as a way to, or turning these experiences into a kind of art or creative expression, as Bazo does with his artwork and Orwell does with his writing, whereas most people aren't especially creative and aren't especially interested in the intellectual expressions of their suffering.
Is there a passage that you think kind of encapsulates the message of this book that you could read out loud for us and we could discuss for a moment?
Oh, man. Well, I have a couple of different passages that encapsulates the book.
Or some point that you think is profound and worthy of chewing on for a little bit.
Well, so one that I really liked, and I think we alluded to it earlier, where he says, there is another feeling that is a great consolation in poverty. I believe everyone who has been hard up has experienced it. It is a feeling of relief, almost of pleasure, at knowing yourself at last genuinely down and out. You have talked so often of going to the dogs, and well, here are the dogs, and you have reached them, and you can stand it. It takes off a lot of anxiety. And I think there is that if there is a passage that encapsulates the book, that might be one of them, because he's describing here how much his world has shrunk. So he's in Paris now, and he's working, and he's struggling to make ends meet, and he's, like you said, working these 14-hour days, and that's everything. He doesn't have to worry about his future anymore. He just has to worry about tomorrow, and maybe this coming weekend, his next day off, the next cigarette, the next meal. And there's a feeling of liberation there, of, all of the status anxiety has been lifted, and you don't have to compare yourself to anyone anymore. You just have to think about survival. And yeah, there's an interesting sort of feeling of freedom that accompanies that.
What does that mean when he says you've got this fear of being down and out?
Mm.
Like, and I think anybody who is well off even can have that fear. But he says once you become it, it's kind of like relief. In what does that relief consist? I mean, I'm trying to get a hold of that a little bit more because I think from the vantage point of the outside looking in, that's the last thing on earth that you want, and it's terrifying. But he's sort of saying, no, when you've got it, you guys make it actually worse than it is. When you actually become the thing and you're poor and you're on the street and you got 50 cents in your pocket, that's what you got. And you're not scared of it anymore. I mean, it's like, so what does that relief consist in?
You don't have to make choices anymore. Your choices are made for you. If you have money and options and prosperity and a lot going on in your life, you have to make often sacrifices, trade-offs, compromises, tough decisions, how you're going to spend your time, what you're going to prioritize in your future. And when you're poor, it's just you have no choice. Just you go to work tomorrow and then you smoke your cigarette, eat your meal, visit your friend, maybe have a cup of tea, and that is the extent of your world.
Yeah.
And there is a strange feeling of relief there. And I think the fear of that may be actually worse than the experience itself. Might be that the fear of losing everything can be more powerful than when it actually occurs, and realizing, as Orwell says, like, well, here are the dogs, and you can stand it, and you're okay, and you learn something new about yourself as well. Sort of this maybe inner resources you didn't know you had.
Yeah, there's a kind of hardening and calcification that comes with the school of experience. Yeah, very good. Let me do something. I've got a passage that I want to read to you.
Sure.
I don't normally do this, but it reminded me of you, or at least of some of the work that you do, and I wanted to get your reaction to it. I'm going to abbreviate if you don't mind, but let me just read this out loud. This is when he's talking about the reason that well-off people, or maybe even middle-class people, they sort of can't stand or can't understand people who are down and out, poor people. And he says this: fear of the mob is a superstitious fear. It is based on the idea that there is some mysterious fundamental difference between rich and poor, as though they were two different races. But in reality, there is no such difference. Everyone who has mixed on equal terms with the poor knows this quite well. But the trouble is that intelligent, cultivated people, the very people who might be expected to have liberal opinions, never do mix with the poor. For what do the majority of educated people know about poverty? And so I wanted to ask you about that quotation, because one of the things that he's saying here is there is a problem in that people who are well off and who supposedly have liberal opinions don't mix with the poor. In his work, the conclusion is they're scared of them. They think they're a mob. They think they're terrifying. They're supposed to be these people of liberal opinions, but when a homeless person comes around, they're like, that's a guy's a piece of trash. Get him away from me. Somebody arrest this guy. In your work, it's a kind of different insight. It's that people of so-called liberal opinions, just like Orwell says, they don't mix with poor people either. But then what begins to happen is that they have views of what's good for these people that they can hold themselves, that these people don't have the luxury to hold. Mm-hmm. And so Orwell's saying it makes them scared of these folks and makes them, get these dirty people away from me. And I can, of course, see that. You're sort of saying the same lack of mixing happens, but they then begin to attribute to these people what they think is good in ways that these people themselves might not think is good. Does that make sense? So I want to get you to reflect on that difference and that insight from Orwell.
Yeah. And if anything, things are probably worse than in Orwell's day. Sort of class stratification has hardened even more, I think, at least in the U.S. context. Things might be different in the U.K., but that same pattern holds. And it's funny. It's a different country. It's a different time. It's a century ago. And yet still it resonates. It's familiar to us. That same way of thinking, those same sort of behavioral and mental habits. It's true. I would say today, very few people who have a bachelor's degree, especially from a selective university, probably never had a 20-minute conversation with someone who didn't go to college. No one in their network. We hardened more and more along education and socioeconomic status, and So as that distance grows, though, the confidence that you know what to do for everyone else seems to either sort of maintain itself or even increase. And this, I think, introduces a lot of potential cultural political instability where you don't know these people, you don't spend time around them, but you have an idea of how they should be living or what's good for them or what policies might be helpful. Um, Not only do a lot of upper middle class people believe they know what's good for these people despite never having spoken with them, they don't even look at the data. I mean, okay, fine, you're not going to go into these neighborhoods, you're not going to spend time with them, you're not going to rub shoulders with them. Okay, at least read about them. At least look at the data. What do they believe generally? I mean, this was famous examples, which I described in many different forms of the whole, the defund the police thing, decriminalizing drugs, decarceration, all of these things that are very popular among supposedly sophisticated, credentialed people. You see far less support for those ideas among people who have less education, who are lower income people.
While reading this book, I couldn't help but think of your own memoir. We invited you out to Princeton this past year to give a talk on your memoir, which is Troubled. And I wonder if you might kind of tell people what that's about, because I think that will help people understand why this book affected you so much.
Well, it's a lot, 300 pages. I'll try to condense it very briefly. I open the preface of Troubled, introducing myself to the reader through my full name. And so my full name is Robert Kim Henderson. And my first name, Robert, comes from my biological father, who I never met. The only information I have about him is his name, which was given to me later by some social workers. My middle name, Kim, comes from my biological mother. So she came to the U.S. from Seoul, from South Korea, as a young woman, and became addicted to drugs, and her life very quickly unraveled. So when I was a baby, we were homeless for a time, lived in a car. Eventually, we moved into this slum apartment in Westlake, which at that time in the early 90s was a pretty rough part of Los Angeles. And when I was 3, some neighbors called the police, and they saw the squalor we were living in. My mom was shooting up and strung out. So the police and some social workers arrived and put me into the Los Angeles foster care system, where I spent the next just shy of 5 years living in 7 different homes all around LA. And then this is where my last name comes from, which was the Henderson family adopted me. And we moved to this kind of dusty blue-collar town in Northern California called Red Bluff. Very working class town. Most of the adults didn't go to college. It was situated in Tehama County, which is one of the poorest counties in the state. It's a part of California no one knows about. It's very rural, very kind of provincial, remote part of California. A lot of crime, a lot of poverty. At that time in the 90s, meth was becoming popular. The opioid crisis was kind of kicking off and becoming more apparent. And in the book, I describe my adoptive parents divorced, a lot of financial catastrophes and drama, turmoil, and so on. And my friends in this town, despite they weren't foster kids like the kids I'd known in LA, but they had kind of family lives that were also fragmented and difficult and neglectful and abusive. And so I describe kind of how we grew up and how we reacted to this in different ways. I had 2 friends from high school who went to prison, another friend who tried to join a gang and was shot to death. And so one reason I fled as soon as I could, why I enlisted, was to just attempt to get away from all of that.
And then you found yourself in the military.
Mm-hmm.
You get out, and then tell me about what happens when you get out.
Yeah, well, I enlisted for, it was 8 years in total in the Air Force, and I needed all 8 of those years to figure out what I wanted to do, to develop, to mature, and then finally started to take my future seriously. I describe how in high school I was a very unfocused student. I read books, but I wouldn't do the homework. It was very scattered. Where I'd get an A in one class because I liked it, then I'd get a D plus in another class because I didn't like it. That's kind of where my head was at as a teenager. And finally, 24 years old, I realized, I can use the GI Bill. And long story short, I ended up going to Yale. At Yale, despite the fact that this was the place where people had lived, and all the institutions I'd been through, unquestionably, these were the most affluent, privileged, comfortable group of people, but they loved talking about themselves more than anyone I'd ever met in my life.
I love it. Yeah.
And I realized, okay, I became more comfortable talking about myself after spending time with them. And then I think that did lead me to becoming more open to the possibility of writing a book. Whereas prior to those experiences, I think I would have thought, there's something immodest or something, I don't know. I had this sort of resistance to talking too much about my life.
Our producer used a really interesting phrase when we were going over this. We were talking about you, that you're kind of a reverse Orwell. Namely, he starts out at the top with the Eton and goes down and sort of, gains insight into the phenomenon from the trip up to the bottom. You start out from your memoir at the bottom and go up to, you've been to the Ivy Leagues now, we're sitting in New York, all these things we could talk. So I'm curious, and there's a sense in which you're flipped, right? You're both circling around the same social problem in two different eras, to be sure. But you're both writers, but you're coming at it from an inverse perspective.
I think there's the similarity. There's something there where we start in different places and then end up opposite. Although Orwell kind of looped back around, after the successes of his book. Although he died in sort of relative poverty. I mean, it was like a genteel poverty towards the end of his life. But yes, I think that's right. And also in the sense that Orwell started, like you said, kind of at the top, and then attempted to describe poverty from the position of someone who wasn't poor. Whereas in my case, especially a lot of my commentary about elite universities, elite institutions, where I'm attempting to describe what I'm witnessing, the culture of elites from the position of someone who wasn't born an elite. And so we're doing maybe there's a reverse anthropological, ethnographic thing here where he's describing the poor to the rich, and I'm attempting to describe the elites, both to people who are not elite, but also to elites themselves. That's been, I receive emails and messages from people who are also first-generation college students, or people who grew up poor, people who had rough lives, or immigrants to America, and they say, I read this essay or whatever, and they say, this helped me to understand what I'm seeing. And so I wasn't trying to do that, but I think kind of class differences are always sort of inherently interesting, especially to people who are outside of that class, but even to people within that class, because sometimes it does take an outsider to illuminate something that maybe you wouldn't otherwise see, because you're adjusted to it, you're habituated to it. It's just your life.
Yeah.
And for me, that was a challenge, writing about my early life, because none of it stood out to me when I was growing up in foster homes and in poverty and so on, that none of it seemed especially notable or interesting. And for me, the interesting thing is elite universities, because that's so foreign to me. And I'm looking at this and I'm trying to take it all in and point out all the differences and details and everything. But I noticed for a lot of people who went through those institutions, they're interested in that, but they're more interested in the early part, the part that they're unfamiliar with. So we like those things that we are not ensconced in.
So what do you make of this? This is kind of a body point, but I can't resist it. Toward the end, Orwell finally comes out and makes some kind of theoretical claims. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing has, in a way, been, for the most part, he occasionally stops and makes an observation, but it's mostly been kind of, narrative journalism. Here's what's happening. Here's what I was doing. Here's how this went. But at the end, he basically says, look, there are really three problems of poverty. One is hunger. Mm-hmm. Another one is idleness, that these people need a purpose. And he, especially he talks about Patty and his willingness to work, but he just didn't have a job. And we've got to find a way to give these people purpose. But the central one is most interesting to me. And that is that one of the deepest problems that people who are down and out face is their access to women. And he says, you will find in society that those who are down and out are majority male. And it's like an extraordinary proportion. And you may know the statistics about this in America today. I don't. But that they're mostly men. There's not that many women. He says women can find somebody to work for, to marry, to take them in, whatever the case may be. For men, it's not true. And so he says you get a lot of men who don't have access to women. And throughout, Boris and Patty and all these people are talking about women and fantasizing about women. There's a terrifying, you call it a rape scene or something in the beginning of a woman. And so women and the problem that down and out men are for women, is pretty frontwards in this book. So I wanted to ask you about, this has the kind of culminating insight on Orwell that a lot of these men turn to homosexuality because they don't have access to women. And so I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but I saw this and thought this is a pretty interesting psychological feature of poverty that I think a lot of folks aren't thinking about.
Yeah, I remember those passages, especially in London when he's talking about the tramps and how women go out of their way to avoid them, the male tramps, the male homeless, and it's interesting because if you read something similar today, it would immediately you'd think, oh, this is sort of incel related kind of commentary here of people who, like men, who are down on their luck and are romantically unsuccessful. And it's interesting that he talks about that because you would think, oh, hunger is the priority, right?
Yeah.
Like you need to eat first, and then you can worry about romantic partners and intimacy and those things. But no, he says that might be even more humiliating in some ways, to be unwanted as a person. And to your earlier point, so there are more. I don't know the exact figure, but there are more homeless men than homeless women, at least in the U.S. And then there are women's shelters and all these services available that men don't have, and probably that too plays some role, that you feel you're on your own in some way and you got to make it work. And I've often wondered if in some ways that kind of rejection is especially hard. Roughly speaking, it seems like men are more evaluated more holistically than women are, at least at first glance, where men in some ways are more superficial, where they'll look at a woman and, oh, do I like her, do I not like her, and base it a lot on appearance. Whereas when women evaluate a man, there's appearance plays a role, but all these other factors. And if you're rejected in that case, it can be painful because you're not just rejected for being unattractive, but you're rejected because as a person, we don't really, we evaluated you on a bunch of different categories, still uninterested.
Yeah.
And I wonder if maybe Orwell was describing something like that about the idleness and the feeling of because he talks about the smell, being poor, you smell bad, you look bad, your mindset shrinks, everything about you becomes less attractive.
The word of the day today is tramp. It came up in my conversation with Rob because the whole book is about tramps. Orwell goes and becomes a tramp. A tramp is somebody known sort of as a vagrant who wanders around, not much but the clothes on their back, maybe a little pack, looking for work, just the change in their pocket. There's a movie, 1915, Charlie Chaplin, called The Tramp, which encapsulates this concept well. But of course, the Disney movie with the cute dogs, Lady and the Tramp. So a tramp, you should avoid being one. This book is full of sort of peculiar insights that you just on a daily basis, you don't think about. You said at the top of the show that you found this thing when you were, 15?
Mm-hmm.
This is something I ask everybody, and the baldest way to ask it is, who is this book for? I see books sitting on a shelf, and I walk through a Barnes & Noble, and it's like walking through a pharmacy. I think every book is a medicine for a certain kind of ailment. Maybe you're there, and you're going through something in your life. I don't know, you lost your job, you got a divorce, you don't know what to do, and you find a book, maybe it's a novel, maybe it's a self-help book, and you pick that up. You picked this thing up at 15 at a pretty vulnerable time in your life. Who is this book for? What is this book medicine for?
Well, for me, it was attempting to make sense of my own experiences. I mentioned growing up in foster homes and in poverty and in kind of chaos and family squalor. and to see, oh, like this is a famous author who went through these impoverished circumstances and attempted to make some meaning out of them, and some interesting reflections and insight, and recognizing, oh, you can go through this and come out and rise above those circumstances. So I think I wouldn't have been able to articulate this at 15, but I think that's what I was attempting to pursue. I was searching for stories like that. I wasn't trying to understand poverty as a concept. I wasn't trying to understand, the man behind in 1984. I just wanted to understand, someone else's experience and brush with poverty, and what they got from that, and hopefully to turn it around.
Yeah, I think that's the most profound way of reading this book. I was thinking earlier, I taught Animal Farm recently, and the students in there, we had read some Marx, and everybody wants to like have this theoretical insight about, and I thought, well, I could teach this book down and out, but everyone would just sort of say in some highfalutin, you're talking about elite universities, some highfalutin way that this is really the beginning of Orwell's flirtation with socialism, and he goes on to be, famously a democratic socialist, but a staunch anti-Stalinist, and we could go over all these isms and these sorts of things about Orwell and his socialism and his Stalinism, and we could academize this thing. But I like what you said so much because it humanizes the book. Don't come to it for that.
And I think it's one of the beauties of the book, is that he doesn't attempt to impose a doctrine of, oh, I'm going to take a socialist approach or a Marxist approach or anything. He only mentions communism once, very briefly. There's this group approaches him asking him to write articles for their English language newspaper in Paris. And they offer him 150 francs per article, which I think today, I looked this up when I read the book, those passages recently. It was something like 180 US dollars equivalent. And that's like really good money when you're down and out.
Yeah.
and so he agrees immediately. And then he returns to this organization and finds that they're gone, they've boarded up, and essentially it turned out to be they were swindlers attempting to scam people out of membership dues.
Yeah.
So, and that's the only time he mentions it. And he doesn't use this as a reflection of, oh, they're exploiting the idea of communism or egalitarianism or anything. He just says, well, all right, back to the kitchen, wash more dishes. And that is what you would think if you were someone in that circumstance. You wouldn't start to have all these highfalutin, abstract, ideological thoughts. You would think, oh, well, there's my chance, make 150 francs, just went out the window, back to work.
One feature of Orwell, famously, that brings readers back to him is his humor. I mean, Animal Farm, which I've recently read, is sort of hilarious. I mean, it's animals talking, first of all, and like one of them's called Napoleon. I mean, the whole thing, and it's Stalin as a pig. And so, I mean, clearly Orwell is irreverent. This book has a kind of, I don't know, today you'd almost call it a black comedy or a dark humor. And I wondered if you might reflect for a moment on the way Orwell uses humor to acquaint readers with the phenomenon of being down and out.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it is, it's British kind of humor, English humor. It's very dry. And I remember there was one line that stood out to me when I read it for the first time, and still resonates now. Orwell's reflecting on returning to London from Paris, and he says, the thought of not being poor made me very patriotic.
Right.
And that line stood out because at that time I was thinking, what am I going to do after high school? And that line jumped out at me when I was thinking about enlisting, which I later did when I was 17. And it's a very kind of cynical, I'm patriotic for these kind of materialistic reasons. He has an interaction with a shopkeeper. He's trying to sell his coat, and the guy refuses. And Orwell thinks something like, you could see his French soul reveling in the pedantry of it. And he has a kind of biting, anti-French, this kind of ethnic humor that maybe you wouldn't see as much today. And it's refreshing, and you can sense there's a kind of like a deeper frustration whenever you see those kinds of lines that are kind of darkly amusing.
Some of the things I found most funny in the book were his observations about Boris, and just the way Boris took such concern over his appearance, but has basically nothing, and has like one shirt collar that he turns inside out, and wants to appear like a head waiter and a man of pride and dignity, at the same time that he's like a total vulgarian when it comes to like his thoughts about women and eating. He eats like a pig, and and he's kind of a crook, but he, you know what I mean? And so just to see the juxtaposition of this man both his vices and his virtues, I thought was quite comical.
Yeah, there's another funny line in the book too. So it just occurred to me where and he uses the humor. It's somehow inoffensive the way he does this. Where he's describing there's one poor guy. I don't think it was Boris, but he is describing how this guy he put on his tie and he tied it in such a way as to hide the holes in his shirt.
I think it was Boris. Yeah,
was it Boris?
I think so.
Okay, yeah. And then he puts on his sock, but the sock has holes in it, and so then he puts shoe polish on his ankles.
Right. That's
so
Boris.
That when he pulls the sock up, and then and then by the time he was all finished up with all these tricks, he actually looked like a half decent, respectable man. And you're laughing as you're reading all of these different ways that Boris tries to present himself, and yeah, it doesn't feel like he's mocking him in any way. There's like an admiration of he's put himself together.
Yeah, because he's touching on something sort of deeply human about all of us. Like you would do the same thing if you needed to have your socks, look good. Let's move to a lightning round.
Sure.
First question for you. What place would you choose to be down and out? Paris, London? I don't know.
Oh, man. Maybe LA. The weather's nice, or San Diego.
Sure.
If you're sleeping outside, there are worse places to do it than the beach.
Yeah. This is an odd question, but what is the best thing about being poor?
You don't have to think as deeply about your future. And on the one hand, there's a misery associated with it, but also a feeling of liberation even the kinds of jobs, the job where you clock in and clock out, where you're paid by the hour. Once you clock out, you're done. You just brain dump everything. You don't have to think. You don't have to look at your email. I sometimes think about that. Think, the job itself sucked, but once I clocked out, I was done. I was like a different person in work and out of work, whereas now you're always on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now that you've, worked your way to the place that you have, what's the best thing about not being where you were when you were a kid?
Everything. I know I just said, email, whatever, but those are such trivial complaints. Just being able to, do what you like, spend time with the people you enjoy being around, not having to worry about bills. Yeah, just everything about it. When I first got a house with some of my friends when I was enlisted, we moved into this house off base. And at the time, I didn't know this, but you had to pay first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. Paid all of this, and that drained my bank account entirely. And I remember just feeling kind of embarrassed because I thought I'm in the military. I'm very patriotic. I'm no longer poor or whatever. And then my bank account is drained. This is in 2009. So all my roommates are like, oh, we're going to go see Avatar. The Avatar movie had just come out. I'm like, oh, I can't go. I have things to do. I made up some excuse. And just feeling like even then, I thought I made it, and still I'm struggling and unable to do something like that. But on the other hand, during that 2-week period when I was waiting for my next paycheck, I could just say no to everything, and there was something nice about that too. So,
you have gone around the country talking about your life, and of course, this concept that you came up with, the luxury beliefs and that sort of thing, which is people who can afford to hold beliefs that others can't for various reasons. I'm curious, what's the most harmful, as you've been talking about this and people ask you this question, what's the most harmful luxury belief that you think has kind of emerged in our culture?
The most harmful? Well, they're all harmful in varying ways, but I think the one that I've probably discussed the most is the denigration of marriage, of two-parent families, of that kind of family unit as being important, because all the other luxury beliefs, flooding the streets with drugs and removing police and all these other kinds of things, those will always present difficulties, but it's much more difficult to bear something like that when you have no family, when you have no loved ones, when you feel sort of disconnected. And I think it's having all kinds of downstream effects. I think the denigration of and disintegration of the family also is related to the decline in marriage, fertility rates, all kinds of things. But maybe that's a separate conversation.
We're going to end on 2 book questions because this is a books podcast. What is the book that our listeners should read, but they probably haven't read yet?
Well, I guess the book that we've been discussing, Down and Out in Paris and London. Since we're discussing Orwell, if you read this book and you enjoy it, he wrote another kind of journalistic memoir, this kind of account of poverty, The Road to Wigan Pier, which was published 4 years later in 1937. Where he's describing coal miners, and in this case, he doesn't actually live as a poor person, but he's just describing, and it's much more reflective as well. And he does describe politics, socialism, social class. It's a more mature kind of book instead of just, here's what I'm going through and here's what I'm experiencing. It's here's what I'm witnessing and here's what it means. And so, in a way, they're kind of two pieces of this puzzle of at least Orwell's account of poverty.
Now let's turn the question on yourself. What's the book you should read, but you haven't?
Oh, man. 50 Shades of Grey. Oh, I don't know. There's a stack of books on my shelf that I should be reading. None of them, there's a lot. I'm reading Montaigne's essays. I'm like 10% of the way through that book.
Well, that's an amazing book.
Yeah, it's superb.
Rob Henderson, thank you for coming to Old School. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Shilo.